So far, it was largely the philosophers who studied human consciousness, but a serious effort to understand consciousness and walk the path towards ultimate reality was made at the MIT World Peace University in the form of the world's first conference on consciousness, the ultimate reality. Many eminent personalities, speakers, thinkers, and philosophers from all over the world share their thoughts on this subject during this conference. Professor Alex Hankey, the scholar of Vedantic philosophy, explained how instabilities in physiological regulation can support self-awareness and consciousness.
Thank you, Professor Ranade. It's a great privilege to be here. I want to thank the organizers of the conference from the bottom of my heart. Dr. Vishwanath Karad, our founder president, always finds wonderful topics for these conferences which can really change our intellectual history. So, the topic of my talk is how instabilities in physiologic regulation enable organisms to support self-awareness. And the whole point is that optimal regulation requires the existence of instabilities. And these instabilities enable organisms to support self-awareness and consciousness. So, the outline is that there will be essentially 5 parts, very short. Background, a part 1 about why regulation requires the instabilities, why instabilities, yes? Okay. Sorry, I'm having difficulty seeing. Part 3, how instabilities support consciousness and self-awareness. They produce self-awareness, and I'll give a very brief summary if we have time. So the background is all to do with molecules and how the molecular biologists get it all wrong. The real thing is that, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty seeing these things. Most scientists still think that life is only complex chemical molecules, and that mere molecules cannot support self-awareness. They conclude that consciousness therefore cannot be explored scientifically. And this presentation is going to explain, through looking at complexity biology, and show that instabilities in regulation can actually support self-awareness and consciousness. Consciousness and self-awareness, most of us would think, are pretty much identical, but you have to be fairly careful in discussing these things. So, molecular biology is incomplete. Molecular biologists wouldn't tell you this. I have to explain it to my biological colleagues in the School of Biology at the Department of Science here. No proper account is given of epigenetic regulation and its infinite beautiful correlations, and these are essential for organisms to be able to adapt, to compete, and to survive in the real world. The problem is that biologists only grow organisms in test tubes, so they never think about what happens in the real world unless they're ecologists, like, say, Dr. Sanjay Deshmukh. And then the ecologists don't feed back into fundamental biology. But my background has been in thinking about the Irish systems of medicine for the last 35 years, and I've managed to transfer my understanding from Ayurveda, yoga, homeopathy, and so on to really good advances in fundamental biology. These build on wonderful discoveries by very famous scientists. So physiologic regulation contains instabilities. The instabilities optimize regulation, they maximize competitiveness, and they solve these problems. So regulation utilizes instabilities because they optimize regulation to external demands. Optimizing regulation maximizes competitiveness, and the most competitive organisms naturally rise to the top and they outcompete everyone else. So every single organism today possesses the key properties that maximize competitiveness. It's just ordinary logic and very reasonable. I don't have to give you technical details to understand it. The key scientist in this is the famous Stuart Kauffman, who wrote his famous book, At Home in the Universe, and he produced an extraordinarily wonderful theory of epigenetic regulation of a holistic kind back in the 1960s as a graduate student from Stanford. And he's a doctor, but the man whose class he was attending at the time was so furious that he spent his nights on computer, that he made him bottom of the class. He is now, of course, a Nobel Prize candidate for his amazing work. And what happens in this particular subject is that when you give an organism a sequence of identical stimuli, you don't get a series of identical responses. They're all very different from each other, and they obey a very special kind of distribution, statistical distribution. The statistical distribution is called a fractal 1/f distribution. Don't worry about what that means, but it is characteristic of the subject in which I happened, by Guru Kripa, to do my own PhD research. It's characteristic of critical instabilities in a subject called phase transitions. So, a very famous scientist who comes next, Per Bak, unfortunately passed away. The late Per Bak showed that these critical these fractal distributions must be due to critical instabilities in physiological regulation. And he coined a term called self-organized criticality, which I've been at pains to slightly explain more fully and more completely. So now let's go on to the next part 2. Instabilities collapse wave functions. Wave functions, please note, cannot produce an effect on other wave functions. They can interfere with them, they can do various other things, superimpose on them, but they cannot collapse them. Now, if you take the definition of consciousness, which comes up in a bit, as consciousness collapses wave functions, it means that quantum wave functions cannot have anything to do with supporting consciousness in the brain. That's why I'm talking about instabilities. So what you get is that you look at pure consciousness and quantum wave functions, and then you look at the things which come later and how they cause stability, quantum fields.